Hello and welcome to Unacademy IAS English, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. A very good morning and welcome to the daily Hindu news analysis. So let's begin today's discussion by first looking at the topics that we are going to discuss. From the Delhi edition of the Hindu, I have chosen 7 important articles for analyzing today's newspaper. We have 5 articles that are relevant for prelims and mains. In fact, related to India's policy on Israel, there are 2 separate articles on page number 14. So that's why I said there are 5 articles in total that are important for prelims and mains. And we have 2 small articles that can be important for the prelims exam. So let's analyze all these topics so that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper again. If you guys are liking our initiatives, benefiting from it, do let us know with your likes, your comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Before we start, please note that today marks the start of UPSC Mains 2024 exams. The exam would have already started, so let's wish all those aspirants who are attempting today all the very best. And we will also conduct a detailed analysis of the mains question papers. This would be very, very useful for 2025 aspirants to understand answer writing, to understand the trend of the question paper. We will be conducting these live sessions right here on our YouTube channel. So today at 2 p.m, we will go live to analyze the essay paper. Tomorrow, we will be discussing GS1, GS2, and on Sunday, we will discuss GS3. So attend all these sessions live so that you can understand the trend of the question paper and also understand the approach to answer writing. With this, let's get started with the discussion by looking at the first article from the editorial page. This article is written by Vivek Katju, a former Indian diplomat, a senior retired IFS officer, and he also headed the negotiating team at Kandahar when India negotiated with the IC-814 hijackers. So Vivek Katju is an expert on Afghanistan and Pakistan. He has served India's Ministry of External Affairs for a very long period, and he brings his expertise into this article. I feel that this article is very interesting, very relevant as well. Here the writer is examining a recent speech that was delivered by the Prime Minister of Malaysia when he visited India last month. You might remember we had covered this topic. The Malaysian Prime Minister was on a visit to India. We spoke about India-Malaysia relations. So during his visit, he delivered an important speech where he spoke about India's freedom fighters. He spoke about the great personalities of India's freedom struggle and the Indian Renaissance. And he appreciated them, their thought, their philosophical ideas and their values, and how it has contributed to the world and the global south especially. So this argument that the writer is presenting, I feel is very important for multiple subjects. So what we are going to discuss could help you in writing answers for a related history question in GS1, maybe a IR question in GS2, because a foreign leader talking about Indian freedom fighters and their philosophy and their values represents the soft power of India, the soft power influence that India exercises as a result of these great personalities. These discussions could help you in answering ethics questions as well. When you're talking about ethics, values, morality, principles, integrity, etc., you can include some of the observations that the writer is making regarding great Indian personalities like Tagore, Nehru, Gandhi, Vivekananda, etc. And of course, it will help you immensely in your essay and even in your optionals, especially those who have political science or even sociology, public administration as their optionals. What we are going to discuss here would be very, very helpful. So first, let's understand the context. So last month, Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim was on a visit to India, state visit to India, and India-Malaysia took their relations forward. I'm sure you know that our relations with Malaysia had become a little complex over the last few years because of Malaysia's internal politics and how Malaysian political parties have aligned more towards conservative Islamist ideology. Malaysia took a surprising stand against India on several sensitive matters like Kashmir, the human rights situation in Kashmir, issues related to Article 370, and even with regard to the Anti-Citizenship Amendment Act protests that were seen in India. So, few years ago, Malaysia became quite hostile to India by siding with Pakistan, by joining Turkey and other countries at global platforms like the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to vote against India on these sensitive matters which are seen as internal matters by India. So, as a result, India-Malaysia relations had taken a hit. India even cut down the palm oil imports from Malaysia. Malaysia is a major exporter of palm oil. India is one of the biggest buyers of palm oil. So, India hit back and punished Malaysia by cutting down the palm oil imports to hit the Malaysian economy. So, our diplomatic relations had taken a hit. But both countries are now making an attempt to repair the damage which has been caused. Now, there is a new Malaysian government under the leadership of Anwar Ibrahim, who is seen as an intellectual, a progressive leader. He is someone who brings a lot of professional expertise. He is someone who is seen as one of the leading intellectual leaders of the world. So, under the new Malaysian Prime Minister, Malaysia is changing its approach towards India and the close relations are being built back. In fact, we have restored the economic ties. We are focusing on defense and strategic relations, which is a continuation of our Act East policy, because Malaysia acquires a lot of priority under the Act East policy. And also Malaysia is home to a very big Indian diaspora community, especially the Tamil community. So, we are focusing on all the aspects of this relationship, and that is why the Malaysian Prime Minister visited India last month. So, during this landmark visit, he delivered a speech at the Indian Council of World Affairs. During this speech, he spoke about India's contribution to the global south. He spoke about the philosophy and the thought of Indian leaders, eminent personalities from our freedom movement like Mahatma Gandhi, Swami Vivekananda, Rabindranath Tagore and Jawaharlal Nehru, and paid tribute to their contribution. So, this is something which is remarkable. If world leaders can appreciate the great personalities of India, their thought, their philosophy, and if they find it to be relevant even today, that is essentially good for India. This is something that India can leverage even today, and there are learnings, lessons for India even today. So, that is what the writer is focused upon. So, he is pointing out that an intellectual leader like Anwar Ibrahim, who is widely regarded around the world, for him to come out and speak about Indian leaders, to revere them, to praise their ideas, their thought, try to apply that in the current context. So, that shows the standing of India as a society, as a civilization. It brings that soft power leverage to India, which we can leverage in our diplomacy as well. Now, before we continue the discussion further, I would like to slightly deviate and talk about the Indian Council of World Affairs, which is mentioned in the article, as it can be very important for your prelims. There can be a factual prelims question based on this organization. So, what is the Indian Council of World Affairs? ICWA is essentially a leading think tank based out of India, based out of New Delhi, that focuses on international relations and promotes India's role in global affairs. It was established back in 1943 during the colonial rule, and it was one of India's first independent think tank. Its only focus is international affairs and India's role in global geopolitics. It conducts a lot of seminars, conferences, symposiums. It brings out research papers and publications as well. It works very closely with the Ministry of External Affairs even today, and it is seen as a leading think tank in the field of international affairs. So, this body has been given statutory status through an Act of Parliament, the Indian Council of World Affairs Act, that was passed in 2001, and it is recognized as an institution of national importance. That is what makes ICWA a prominent institution. So, now it is headed by the Vice President of India as the ex officio Vice President. The Vice President of the country, by virtue of being the Vice President, occupies the President role as far as the Indian Council of World Affairs is concerned, and the Minister of External Affairs becomes the Vice President. So, this think tank is based out of Sapru House, a very popular location in New Delhi, which is named after Sir Tej Bahadur Sapru. And this think tank is also a member of the UN Academic Impact. So as one of the leading influential think tanks of India, it works closely with Ministry of External Affairs to organize these conferences and symposiums and gatherings, and brings out research papers as well in the field of international affairs. This act enacted by the Parliament lays down the objectives of Indian Council of World Affairs. Its prime objective is to promote the role of India, the legacy, the history of India, the culture of India, and leverage that in Indian diplomacy to promote India's role and influence in international affairs, to promote our relations with other countries. So that is what you need to know about this important organization, based on which you can expect a prelims question. Now coming back to the discussion, the writer Vivek Arju talks about the high praise that Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has placed on Indian personalities. He talks about India's leadership of the global south right from the beginning. In this speech, he spoke about how India has championed the cause of developing underdeveloped countries. He recollected how India stood for decolonization after independence. He spoke about the contribution of leaders like Nehru and how India emerged as a champion of the global south. Post 1947, the Nehru government, which adopted an independent foreign policy and maintained the principle of strategic autonomy, raised its voice at the global level at United Nations, supporting the decolonization of the world. We took a stand against colonialism and imperialism. So the Malaysian leader paid tribute to the idea, the vision of Nehru, how Nehru contributed not just to India and its diplomacy, but to the whole world, how India championed the global south. And that is what you see today as well in our diplomacy, in our foreign policy. So the Malaysian Prime Minister praised the Modi government for India's excellent handling of the G20 that we hosted last year, and how India gave a voice to the global south countries during the G20 summit. Last year, India launched a new initiative called Voice of Global South Summit. And till date, 3 editions of the summit has taken place. And India has essentially represented the voice of the global south, of the developing, underdeveloped countries. So the Malaysian leader paid tribute to India for this contribution, and he credits India's intellectualism and as well as India's philosophical leadership, which automatically positions India as a leader of the developing, underdeveloped world. He has said that leaders like Nehru made a tremendous contribution. He pointed towards Nehru's historic speech, a tryst with destiny speech on the eve of India's independence. How Nehru spoke about the value of freedom, how it can help the downtrodden sections, the weaker, vulnerable sections, how it can uplift people from poverty, how independence for India could mean upliftment for peasants, workers and tribal communities. This is exactly what the world needs even today. The world needs equality, justice, inclusiveness. So the Malaysian leader remembered Nehru's contribution, his philosophy and ideals, and paid tribute to that, and he said it is very relevant even today, because even today the world is affected by uncertainties. We are living in a world affected by conflicts. We are living in a very uncertain economic environment. We are living in a world where the environment has been significantly damaged, and this is impacting the weaker sections and the vulnerable sections. So the Malaysian Prime Minister said that philosophy of Nehru, the contribution of Nehru remains relevant. He spoke about Swami Vivekananda, his teachings, his belief in spiritual unity. Now, who doesn't remember the historic speech that Swami Vivekananda delivered at Chicago during the World Religion on Parliaments in 1893? In the very same month, on September 11th, Swami Vivekananda not only championed the ideals of Hinduism and Sanatan Dharma and Indian civilization, but he championed the cause of spiritual unity, which is necessary in the world. Right? So the Malaysian leader paid tribute to Swami Vivekananda, even recollected that he was a disciple of Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, and he paid tribute to Vivekananda's thought of spiritual unity, which remains relevant even today in a world which is divided by religious conflicts and divides. The Malaysian Prime Minister recalled the contribution of Rabindranath Tagore through his literary works, how Tagore advocated peace, inclusion and equality. So this had an enormous role to play in our freedom struggle. The thought of Swami Vivekananda, Tagore, Nehru and of course Mahatma Gandhi. His belief in non-violence, his belief in forgiveness, his belief in satyagraha as a form of resistance. This is something that has wide global appeal even today. That's why leaders like Gandhi are revered around the world, from Africa to United States to even across Asian, South American countries. In almost every country, there are statues of Mahatma Gandhi paying tribute to him. Mainly, the tribute is to his ideals, to his philosophy, which was transformative, revolutionary in a world that was affected by wars and conflicts, where countries, people, and governments settled disputes through wars and conflicts. Mahatma Gandhi was probably the only rare leader and individual who said that you can achieve your goals through non-violence, through ahimsa, through satyagraha, through forgiveness. So that is something the Malaysian leader recalled. The thought, the philosophy of these great Indian personalities. He recalled those contributions, and he said that these are relevant even today. That is what makes India a great civilization. Now, I think this is what we need to take away from the article and from the speech of the Malaysian Prime Minister. When you're writing your mains answers, be it a history question, be it a IR question on soft power, or be it an ethics question, or be it an essay, or be it your optional papers, you can try to inculcate the thought and the philosophy of these great Indian personalities. Of course, there are many more, from Tilak to Sardar Patel to Subhash Chandra Bose to Bhagat Singh, right? But since the Malaysian leader spoke about these four eminent personalities, the focus of the article is limited to them. But of course, you can expand your thought. You can read a little more about them, try to include few pointers in your answers. You can mention how Swami Vivekananda championed spiritual unity decades ago, how it remains relevant even today, how India can leverage Vivekananda's teachings, which does remain popular in some parts of the world. There are several universities where the thought of Vivekananda is still, it's still nourished and nurtured. It is valued. You can talk about the universalism of Tagore and his literary works, which is again taught in universities around the world. And many global leaders look up to the likes of Vivekananda and Tagore. Maybe they may not be very popular amongst the masses, right? But definitely amongst intellectuals and global leaders in academic institutions, Vivekananda, Tagore, Gandhi, Nehru and others, they are held in high esteem around the world. So even in diplomacy, we need to tap that. Gandhi's emphasis on non-violence remains relevant more than any other time in point in history. Even today, in a world that is divided with wars and conflicts, Gandhi's philosophy of non-violence and ahimsa and satyagraha remains evergreen. It's an evergreen ideology. And same goes for Nehru and his contribution. Nehru was widely regarded for his modern liberal thought, for transforming India into a modern state, a liberal constitutional setup, and introducing scientific rigor to build an equal, inclusive society. See, internally in domestic politics, many of these eminent personalities might be criticized. But if you look at the world view of these eminent personalities, it is very different. There is a stark contrast. Within India, there might be critics of Nehru, critics of Gandhi, critics of Vivekananda as well, right? But however, if you look at the global opinion, that is quite different. All these great Indian personalities are widely regarded. That is something we should cherish and leverage as well in current times and try to apply their philosophy and thought to solve current problems. Be it uplifting the global south, solving problems of poverty, tackling wars and conflicts, there are lessons we can draw from the thoughts of these great Indian personalities. And that is, I think, something remarkable, and that is what we need to take away from this article. Now, based on this, there can be a question. UPSC might ask a question related to great Indian personalities, their thought, how it influenced India's world view, how the world perceives India. Right? Wherever you go around the world, there is a certain perception of India, and a part of it goes to the great Indian personalities who built India's image as a great civilization, right? And how these values and thoughts and principles could remain relevant, how it can be applied in today's world. So if you are able to analyze this and bring out your views, I think you should be able to answer any given question. So take up this as a practice question. The world view of great personalities of India's freedom movement and the Indian Renaissance is still revered around the world and continues to remain relevant in a world fraught with challenges and uncertainties. Examine. So for such a question, you can start your answer maybe by talking about the contribution of eminent Indian personalities. You can pick a few great Indian leaders from our freedom movement, from the Renaissance period, it could be spiritual leaders, including Vivekananda, Ramakrishna Paramahamsa and the others, or it could be freedom fighters from Gandhi to Bhagat Singh to Subhash Chandra Bose to Nehru to Sardar Patel, right? So pick a few leaders, talk about their great contribution to India, to India's culture, to India's freedom movement, and how they have built a global following, how their thoughts and views are globally appreciated, even today, which creates a perception for India, positive perception for India. And then present the current challenges in the world, how the world is still affected by poverty, how the world is still affected by wars and conflicts, and how their philosophies and their teachings can be relevant, how we can apply them in today's context. Maybe you can link this with Russia-Ukraine war and India's role in mediating between Russia and Ukraine. You can refer to our balanced position on Israel-Palestine issue with regard to the Gaza war, and how India always promotes peace and diplomacy and talks and negotiations. Clearly, this approach of India stems from the ideas of Gandhi, Nehru, Vivekananda, Tagore and others. So that is something you need to bring in, and you need to show that you are able to interconnect these topics. So that would make for a good answer for this question. So let's see how many of you can write this. You can treat this as an essay topic as well, right? Great Indian personalities, their thought and philosophy, how it is perceived around the world, how it is relevant even today in a world which is divided. So maybe you can write an entire essay as well. So please take it up and use this as a practice question. Now let's move on to the next article. Let's look at this column from page 12 on Sri Lanka's economic and political problems. See, tomorrow, September 21st, Sri Lanka is headed towards elections. Now this is a big development. India will be closely watching the elections because Sri Lanka is a key neighbor. As part of Sagar Doctrine, security and growth for all in the region, India prioritizes the countries in the Indian Ocean. We pay very close attention to the island countries present in the Indian Ocean. So India is interested in political stability. India is interested in economic stability and security of the entire Indian Ocean region. So Sri Lanka remains a top focus, a top priority. And in the context of these upcoming elections, the column is examining Sri Lanka's recent economic crisis. What caused the crisis? How Sri Lanka suffered? How Sri Lanka has been able to turn around the crisis and how it's rebuilding the economy? And what could be the implications of these elections? Where does Sri Lanka stand today? And how does it impact India and its interests in the Indian Ocean? That is the focus of this article. So let's take a quick look. See, 2 years ago in 2022, Sri Lanka was hit by a devastating economic crisis. Sri Lanka basically ran out of its forex reserves. Its forex reserves were depleted, as Sri Lanka was in no position to service the massive foreign debt that it had borrowed. Over the last couple of decades, Sri Lankan governments have borrowed excessively from countries like China, even India and Japan, and even from the global markets, and even from institutions like IMF, World Bank, etc. So Sri Lanka had carried out excessive expenditure. Sri Lanka had obsessed with militarization during the ethnic civil war with Tamil militant outfits. It invested in several unnecessary projects. It took up some grand initiatives which were never financially viable. And eventually the foreign debt started piling up. And this debt burden led to a crisis where Sri Lanka was in no position to repay the debt. Its forex reserves had been depleted, and also there was gross economic mismanagement by the Sri Lankan government, especially by the Rajapaksa brothers, who are in power for most part of the last 2 decades. Mahinda Rajapaksa was the president from 2005 to 2015 for a decade. Then his brother Godbaya Rajapaksa became the president from 2019 to 2022. So during this entire period, when the Rajapaksa family was in power, a lot of disastrous policies were initiated. For example, Sri Lanka shifted towards organic farming without any scientific basis. As fertilizer imports had become expensive, the Sri Lankan government banned the import of fertilizers and forced Sri Lankan farmers to switch to organic farming without any thought, without any transition plan. This significantly hurt Sri Lanka's agriculture, especially its commercial plantation crops. I hope you know Sri Lanka is a major producer of tea, rubber, spices. These are major exports of Sri Lanka that brings revenue, that brings foreign exchange. So these critical agricultural exports were hit when the country was forced to switch to organic farming without a solid basis. Then the Rajapaksa brothers, they had announced lot of tax cuts in order to please the voters to win elections. They had announced massive tax cuts as a populist scheme when they were trying to contest the 2019 elections. They were trying to create a vote bank through these populist measures, and that is primarily how Gotabaya Rajapaksa came to power in 2019. These tax cuts were unsustainable. It significantly affected the revenue that was being generated for the Sri Lankan government. Then upon that, there were global events like COVID-19 pandemic, the terror attack in Sri Lanka in 2019, the Easter Sunday bombings, and Russia-Ukraine war. These events affected the Sri Lankan economy, mainly the flow of tourists. For Sri Lanka, tourism is a big source of revenue. It's a preferred destination by foreign tourists. So because of all these events, first the Easter Sunday bombings carried out by a local Sri Lankan terror group called NTJ, which is affiliated with Islamic State. This major attack, it affected the security situation, the image of Sri Lanka, and tourist flow started reducing. Then came the deadly pandemic, which led to lockdowns and travel restrictions. For several months, tourism industry collapsed in Sri Lanka. This increased joblessness. It caused major economic disruption to the Sri Lankan economy. Then came the Russia-Ukraine war, which disrupted supply chains again, increasing commodity prices, and Sri Lanka was in no position to import the expensive commodities from abroad. So this was a nightmare scenario for Sri Lanka. From everywhere, Sri Lankan economy was hit. There was economic mismanagement, wasteful expenditure, excessive unnecessary borrowing, which increased the foreign debt, and the revenue had been hit, exports had been hit, and Sri Lanka got into a position where it couldn't sustain imports anymore. Even essential commodities could not be imported, like fuel, gas, medicines, even paper. So Sri Lanka got to a stage where it had to postpone exams because it didn't have paper to conduct the examinations. It had to restrict economic activities as the country was running out of fuel, gas, even food and medicines. And this triggered a mass uprising. The people rebelled against the Rajapaksa government. They threw out the Rajapaksa government from power, and a unity government was formed. Various political parties came together to form a unity government to stabilize the Sri Lankan economy and to address the economic crisis. So that is how Ranil Wickremesinghe, the current Sri Lankan leader, became the president. And since then, Sri Lanka is trying to work around this economic crisis. Now, this is where you need to understand the role of India. Even though the article doesn't talk about it, I would like to tell you about India's assistance given to Sri Lanka. Let's go beyond the article. Let's understand this in detail. Because India was the primary support to the Sri Lankan economy when the crisis hit the country. Over the last 2 years, we have arranged nearly $4 billion in support. This is in line with our vision of being a net security provider. See, India wants to be the first responder to help any country in the Indian Ocean region when they face a crisis. Be it a security crisis or a disaster or an economic crisis, India wants to be the first responder. Right? This is the vision of India under the Sagar Doctrine, to become the net security provider of the region that allows India to establish its dominant traditional influence. So as soon as Sri Lanka went through the crisis, India came out with a $4 billion assistance package. We provided fresh line of credit. These lines of credit given by India, these are concessional loans. Now you might think, how will new loans help a country facing a debt crisis? See, these loans are very flexible. They come with a relaxed repayment schedule, very low interest rates, and an extended deadline. So it's not a burden. So this provides immediate liquidity for a country like Sri Lanka to overcome the crisis. We also gave grants and sent aid material. We supplied essential items like milk, medicines, food items, and even fuel to support the Sri Lankan economy, to help the common people in Sri Lanka. We gave grants as well, which Sri Lanka need not pay back to India. And we also deferred some of the loan repayments. Some loan repayments were pending, which Sri Lanka was supposed to honor. But India deferred the repayment and gave an extended deadline. We restructured those loans, giving a breathing space for Sri Lanka. We worked out a currency swap arrangement. We provided a currency swap where the central bank, the RBI, would swap the currency with the Sri Lankan currency, which gives liquidity to Sri Lanka to deal with the crisis. And we worked with the global community to help Sri Lanka manage the crisis situation. India worked with Japan, which is another major lender to Sri Lanka, and we worked with the Paris Club of countries, the Paris Club of creditors. The Paris Club, it's an informal group of creditor nations, all the developed large economies which give loans and funds to other small countries, the debtor nations. So when countries face a crisis like this, when they are not able to repay the foreign debt, the Paris Club of countries, they work together, they create a restructuring plan. They basically restructure the loans, defer the payments, giving a breathing space for the country facing a liquidity crisis. So India worked with Japan and Paris Club of creditors to create that space for Sri Lanka so that it can focus on economic reforms. Because Sri Lanka desperately needed support from the IMF, from the International Monetary Fund. The IMF provides such contingency funding or emergency funding when a country faces a crisis. For example, in 1991, when India faced a BOP crisis, the balance of payments crisis, right? Even we ran out of forex reserves. We didn't have enough forex reserves left to continue our imports. So India also took help from the IMF. But problem is with IMF, if you need assistance from IMF, it is conditional. You have to fulfill certain conditions. You need to carry out certain reforms. Like for example, you have to tackle inflation, restructure the loans, you have to devalue your currency, right? So it feels like your economic sovereignty is getting compromised. IMF places those conditions and you feel that IMF is violating your economic sovereignty. But in a crisis situation, that is the option. There is no other choice available. You need to initiate those reforms, implement more free market reforms and cut down the cost, increase government revenue, cut down the expenditure, right? So once these reforms are initiated, IMF will come out with a bailout package and this will help a country going through a crisis. So Sri Lanka also has been working with IMF over the last 2 years and it has received around $3 billion in support through an extended fund facility. This extended fund facility of the IMF was worked out with help from India, Japan and Paris Club of creditors. Sri Lanka managed to restructure the economy over the last couple of years. It brought down the unnecessary expenditure. It increased the taxes, even though it has been unpopular domestically, because obviously people who are suffering, they will not like higher taxes, but that is the need of the hour. It's a necessity to rebuild the economy. It will cause economic pain. So even though domestically it has been very unpopular and criticized, the Sri Lankan government has raised the taxes to increase government revenue. It has cut down its expenditure mainly to balance the deficit, to bring down the unsustainable deficit. It has tried tackling inflation. It has brought back market pricing for fuel and energy, for oil and gas. And more importantly, it has reformed the public sector enterprises which were loss-making enterprises. Most of these measures are seen as unpopular by the people because the tax rates, if they are increased, it will hurt the common people. That too when they are jobless, when the economy is already hit, when the cost of living has already become difficult. Increase in taxes will hurt the people, but as I said, this is a bitter pill, a bitter medicine which has to be swallowed by Sri Lanka. Similarly, reform of public sector units will be resisted because any such reforms could affect the employees, it could affect the social interests, and despite that Sri Lanka had to do this, it had to reform these institutions which were loss-making enterprises. So thanks to these reforms initiated by the Ranil Wickremesinghe government, today Sri Lanka's economy is on a path to recovery. So India has played a very important role as part of the official creditor committee, the OCC. India, Japan and Paris Club together with around 17 countries have worked out an agreement to restructure all the loans that were pending. And China, which was the largest debtor country, which had given the highest debt, the largest creditor country to Sri Lanka, which had given the highest debt, has signed a separate agreement with Sri Lanka. Because initially China was not willing to be part of India, Japan and Paris Club. It has parallelly negotiated with Sri Lanka and signed a separate agreement for restructuring the debt. And as a result of the restructuring of the loans, Sri Lanka has got a breathing space. So with the tax reforms and the governance reforms and the overall economic reforms, Sri Lanka's economy is on the path to recovery. Almost $14 billion worth of sovereign debt has been restructured, which Sri Lanka had borrowed from the global markets. Close to $6 billion of bilateral loans have been restructured with India, Japan and China. So this restructuring gives a space for Sri Lanka, plus the reduction in expenditure, increase in revenue and the cut down of unnecessary expenses, even social security expenses like pension, provident fund, even these costs have been cut. Again, I know it hurts the people, it hurts the common man in Sri Lanka, but these harsh measures have become necessary. So though the Sri Lankan government has become unpopular because of these measures, it was necessary to recover and rebuild the Sri Lankan economy. And today the results are evident. There is a turnaround which is being witnessed. Inflation has become manageable. From high double-digit inflation in the range of 25 to 30%, inflation has come down to single digits again. There is a recovery in growth at a time when the global economy itself is depressed. Sri Lanka has managed to register a 2 or 3% growth, which is still quite significant. It has brought down its overall expenses, the deficit has gone down, the revenue collection has increased. So these are positive numbers for the Sri Lankan economy. The Hindu depicts this in the form of various graphs. The graphs themselves are not necessary for you, but just understand that Sri Lankan economy is staging a recovery. It's looking at a turnaround because of improved macroeconomic performance. Now this is where you should be able to understand the impact of the upcoming elections. See, these reforms were necessary. As I said, it's a bitter pill, but of course it has affected the common man. The Sri Lankan people are not happy, correct? They are not happy that taxes have gone up, there is joblessness. First of all, tourism had taken a dip, right? And exports had gone down, agriculture had taken a hit. So unemployment rates are higher. Social security has been cut down. From pensions to insurance and provident fund has been cut down. Plus, more people have lost jobs because of restructuring of public sector units. So definitely there is anger at the ground level, and this might create anti-incumbency. Right? So people might vote against the current government, against the current leaders in the upcoming elections. So most likely we are looking at a change in government, a change in leadership. Right? This is very likely, it might happen. So if this were to happen, India should be prepared. Any political change will have its own impact on India's interests. See, India's interest is primarily to ensure that Indian Ocean region remains stable and peaceful. We want to curtail the role and influence of external powers which interfere in the Indian Ocean, especially China. You know what China did? China leveraged the economic crisis and it got strategic gains out of this. That's why China didn't agree to work with India, Japan and Paris Club to restructure the loans. It negotiated a separate agreement with Sri Lanka to restructure the pending loans. And Chinese armed forces have gotten more access into Indian Ocean through Sri Lanka. We have heard reports of Chinese spy vessels and naval vessels of the PLA Navy, docking in Sri Lankan ports like Colombo and Hambantota. The strategic Hambantota port is controlled by a Chinese company. This was another wasteful project taken up by the Rajapaksa government. The project failed commercially. Sri Lanka couldn't repay the loan, and eventually Sri Lanka gave away Hambantota port, a strategic port in the Indian Ocean, to a Chinese company for 99 years lease. China is involved in the East Container Terminal project at Colombo port. It already has a significant control over Colombo port and its operations. So this has strategic implications for India. The rising influence of China. If there were to be a government change, if a leadership were to emerge which is pro-China or which can be blackmailed and arm twisted by China, this could increase China's military and diplomatic and strategic presence and influence that could run counter to Indian interests. So this is what India would look out for. India would look out for the possible threats that might emerge following the elections. We just want a peaceful transition. We want a stable government which balances India's interests with its relations with other countries. We have no problem if Sri Lanka is close to China. That's not the problem. The problem is we don't want Sri Lankan government to unnecessarily favor China and allow China and even maybe Pakistan to interfere with India's interests. That is something that India would strongly oppose. So we would be interested to see a peaceful transition and a government which protects India's interests. That is the bare expectation, the minimum expectation from India. So let's see what happens. Now take up this question, examine the turnaround that is underway in the Sri Lankan economy, what challenges lie ahead and how does it affect India. So based on what we have discussed, I think you should be able to bring out an analysis, and let's see how many of you can write an answer to this question. Now let's look at another article on page 14 related to security and international relations. This article is related to FATF and India's performance in implementing FATF standards and FATF recommendations. So let's quickly understand what is FATF, what does it do, and what is this review of FATF and what is India's performance. FATF stands for Financial Action Task Force. It's an intergovernmental body that was established in 1989 by the G7 countries. It is headquartered in Paris at the OECD headquarters, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. It's an economic grouping of West European developed economies. So FATF is this intergovernmental body that was set up by the G7 developed industrialized economies in 1989, mainly to counter money laundering, to implement anti-money laundering measures, or as we call it, AML measures. Because by late 80s, money laundering was becoming a serious concern. Money laundering is an illegal practice of converting illegal wealth into legal wealth. Essentially, in simple terms, it's an illegal process of converting black money into white. Illegal wealth generated through illegal sources like corruption, criminal activities, tax evasion, that can be laundered. The dirt on the money can be cleaned. Essentially, the illegal source can be removed, and the owners of the money can be separated from the black money, and eventually through a lot of complex transactions it can be turned into clean wealth, legal wealth. So this process is called money laundering. It's a very complex process, a global scandal of sorts, where money is moved around through various jurisdictions including tax havens. The money is basically pushed into the economic system itself through fraudulent methods, and very complex transactions are carried out by professionals. And eventually at the end of it, the money is separated from its illegal source, from the actual owner of the wealth. The distance is created. So that is how the dirt is removed. The dirt on the black money is nothing but the illegal source and the ownership. If this is removed, even if you try to investigate and trace back the source of the money, you will never find out the actual source and the actual owner. So this complex process of hiding the illegal source of money and the owner of the wealth is money laundering. It's an economic threat and a security threat. So to tackle this economic crime, G7 countries formed FATF, and today it's a leading intergovernmental body. India is a member as well. India is a member of FATF that implements anti-money laundering measures. Then in 2001, after the 9/11 attacks carried out by Al-Qaeda, we realized the linkages between money laundering and terrorist financing. It came to light that there was a direct connection between money laundering, organized crime, and terrorist financing. So as the United States launched a global war on terrorism after the September 11 attacks, the global community launched a war against money laundering and terrorist financing as well. Because the proceeds of drug trafficking, arms trafficking, human trafficking, such illegal criminal activities, and the money which was being laundered around the world, including black money, which was essentially generated through corruption and tax evasion, part of that money was flowing into the hands of terrorist groups, enabling terrorist activities. The 9/11 attacks was funded mainly through Hawala channels, through Hawala networks, which is an informal way of transferring money from one country to another, which is part of the money laundering network. So once this came to light, once the linkages between money laundering channels, criminal cartels and terrorist groups was clearly established, the world began a war against terror financing and money laundering. So FATF's goal was expanded. Along with tackling money laundering, it was given a second mandate to counter terrorist financing, or as we call it, CTF. in short. So these are the two primary objectives of FATF, to come out with global standards, to come out with recommendations which have to be followed by all countries and jurisdictions. They have to bring out national laws, they have to bring out legislations which is in line with FATF standards and recommendations. They have to implement the policies and enforce them. So these anti-money laundering or AML measures and counter-terrorist financing CTF measures, they have to be incorporated by every jurisdiction into their national law and policies. This is what FATF recommends, and it's mandatory. There are FATF-styled regional bodies around the world which monitor the performance of the countries and review their performance periodically. Is that clear? So FATF has the powers to enforce its recommendations as well. So countries are expected to bring out national legislation and policies to enforce anti-money laundering standards and counter-terrorist financing measures. They have to set up institutions as well, such as Enforcement Directorate, which can act as a law enforcement agency. They should set up a financial intelligence unit to collect financial intelligence from the banking and financial system, to enforce checks and balances, to check suspicious financial activity and transactions. So all these institutional measures have to be taken up. Money laundering cases and terror financing cases have to be strictly prosecuted. Quick punishments have to be delivered by the courts. So all this performance is reviewed by FATF. Now the question is, how can FATF punish? How can FATF deliver punishment to those countries which don't follow these measures? See, FATF conducts a periodic review with the help of its regional bodies. Every country, every jurisdiction goes through the review. They look at the laws, the policies, the cases that have been investigated, the conviction rate, how prosecution has been handled. They look at the efficiency of tackling money laundering, terror financing, the seriousness of the country. They review the entire performance periodically and bring out a report. Now, if a country's performance is not satisfactory, let's say there are gaps, there are shortcomings in the laws and policies and the actions of a country, such a country can be placed on the grey list of FATF. This is like issuing notice to a country that, look, you're not following the standards, you're not up to mark, you need to improve your performance. Recently, for example, Pakistan was on the grey list of FATF. Pakistan has been grey listed multiple times. In fact, India has used this platform to target Pakistan for its sponsorship of terrorism. India, along with other countries like US, France and others, have shown how Pakistan enables money laundering and terror financing to sponsor terrorism. So because of these efforts, Pakistan has been grey listed multiple times. And when you're grey listed, it can have an impact. It will hurt the image of your economy. Investors will hesitate to invest in the country. Right? Your trade could be affected. Your ability to borrow loans and funds from global markets, global institutions could be affected. World Bank, Asian Development Bank, IMF, they'll hesitate to give loans to such countries which are grey listed, which means they are not following the banking standards, the basic standards needed in the financial banking system. Essentially, there are loopholes which allows money laundering to happen, allows terrorist financing to happen. So grey listing is like a notice to that country to improve their performance. So FATF gives them an action plan with specific targets and a deadline within which the targets have to be achieved. So if a country shows the improvement, if it shows the willingness to implement the action plan, implement those targets within the deadline, the country might be removed from the grey list after the next review. But even after repeated warnings and even after repeated grey listing, if a country is not improving its performance, if a country is deliberately non-cooperative, then such countries can be punished by FATF by blacklisting them. Currently, we have 3 countries which have been blacklisted: North Korea, Iran and Myanmar. These countries have been found to be deliberately non-cooperative, meaning they are deliberately not implementing anti-money laundering and counter-terror financing measures, which means they are involved in backing terrorist groups, enabling money laundering. So once you're blacklisted, this brings economic sanctions on the country. No investor will invest in such a country. Foreign trade of the country will be completely hit. It will become almost impossible to trade with the country, for this country to export and import. It will affect the sovereign credit rating, and it won't be able to raise loans or funds even from global institutions like World Bank. So this will lead to severe economic impact on the blacklisted countries. That is how FATF can punish those countries. And that is the reason why FATF review is so important. So India recently went through one such review, a periodic review, and the FATF has praised India's performance. Overall, India has a high degree of compliance with FATF standards because we are a responsible power. We are deeply affected by terrorist financing. India is one of the biggest victims of terrorism. We are affected by state-sponsored terrorism, which comes from our neighbors like Pakistan. We are affected by money laundering and terror financing. So naturally, India is inclined to seriously implement these measures. So we have two laws in place which implement the FATF standards. One is PMLA, Prevention of Money Laundering Act. We have amended this law multiple times to bring it up to FATF standards. So PMLA mainly deals with anti-money laundering measures. It declares money laundering as a criminal offence. It establishes and gives the powers to Enforcement Directorate to enforce the law and to investigate money laundering offences. We also have a financial intelligence unit in India, FIU India, that keeps a check on the financial banking system. It recommends the standards of record keeping for banks and financial institutions. It enforces the KYC norms, right, to ensure that the customers are thoroughly verified, their identity is verified. Any suspicious activity and transactions are flagged and investigated. So we have created a robust architecture, an institution with the required laws and policies to crack down on money laundering. And we have implemented the counter-terrorist financing measures through the UAPA, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. The UAPA, which is our primary law against terrorism, has been amended multiple times to include the CTF measures, the counter-terror financing measures. So PMLA and UAPA, they work hand in hand to allow India to implement anti-money laundering counter-terror financing measures as recommended by FATF. So FATF has praised India's performance. India has shown a very high degree of compliance, technical compliance with the global standards. But however, there are some concerns, some shortcomings which have been pointed out. One major shortcoming is that not enough prosecution has been done under these laws. Though thousands of cases have been filed by ED, you might remember PMLA was recently amended in 2019. It was made into a stringent law giving tremendous powers to Enforcement Directorate. See, ED already had the powers to confiscate the proceeds of the crime, to confiscate all the assets of money laundering. It has been given even more powers to arrest without a warrant. The burden of proof is on the accused, right? The prosecution need not prove the guilt, but the accused has to prove their innocence. So such stringent provisions are provided, and through the recent amendments in 2019, PMLA became even more stringent. It even led to criticism and accusation that the center was misusing ED to target opposition leaders and political parties, especially at the state level. So as a result, the many cases were filed at Supreme Court challenging the constitutionality of PMLA and the amendments. So these legal cases and challenges slowed down the overall implementation of PMLA. It slowed down the prosecution of several cases. And also don't forget, our judiciary is overburdened with cases. There is a backlog of cases. Now this is a concern FATF has flagged. It has pointed out that look, your judiciary is very slow. See, under the law, under UAPA, PMLA, we have special courts to take up these cases, money laundering, terror financing cases. Problem is the capacity of our courts and the law enforcement agency is overwhelmed. ED has taken up more than 4,000 cases, but it does have a high conviction rate of around 97%. But there are many cases which are pending in prosecution or which have never been taken to prosecution. So this is a shortcoming that has been flagged by FATF that look, you have to improve your investigation, step up prosecution of cases, carry out more prosecutions. For that, you have to have an efficient judicial structure as well. The judiciary should have the capability to fast track those cases. So this is where India needs to show improvement. These are recommendations given by FATF, and it has urged India to increase the prosecutions, to reduce the burden on the judiciary and ensure that more cases are prosecuted. So in the case at the Supreme Court, where constitutional validity of PMLA was challenged, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutional validity of the law, right? But these legal battles led to the delays. It essentially slowed down the prosecution of cases as well, according to the government of India. So FATF has said you need to make improvements on these areas. But other than that, India has shown a high degree of compliance with FATF standards. Now let's quickly look at India's policy on Israel. We have two articles on page 14 that talks about India's position on Israel. One is with regard to the allegations that India has been supplying arms and weapons to Israel. See, there have been several media reports that artillery and ammunition manufactured in Indian defense factories have been found in Gaza. A few shells and casings have been found in Gaza with markings of Indian defense companies, leading to accusations that the Indian government allowed the shipment of arms and weapons to Israel during the ongoing Gaza war. Similar reports have come from Ukraine and Russia. Lot of images are circulating on social media. Even Western media has brought out these articles accusing India of supplying ammunition, artillery and weapons to both Russia and Ukraine. The allegation is that Indian weapons and ammunition and artillery has been found with Russian forces and even with Ukrainian forces. Now the government of India has denied all these reports. India has said these reports are misrepresenting the situation. India has said, look, we have a clear policy, a policy to take a balanced position on Russia-Ukraine war, not to supply arms and weapons to either side to aggravate the conflict, rather play the role of a peacemaker. Similarly, with regard to Israel-Palestine, we have a balanced position, and given the accusations against Israel that it has used disproportionate force, committed human rights violations, India has taken a policy decision to not supply any armament to Israel as well. Very high sources have informed the media that Defense Ministry with Ministry of External Affairs, they took a policy decision that will ensure that Indian made ammunition, armaments will not land in the hands of Israel, Russia or Ukraine. So then how come there are these media reports and images showing Indian made ammunition in these war zones? What's happening is that maybe there are other third parties who are procuring the ammunition from India and re-exporting it to countries like Ukraine. For example, there are European countries which are arming Ukraine, supplying weapons to Ukraine. So there are reports that few European vendors are buying from India and then secretly re-exporting it to Ukraine. Maybe that could be a reason why Indian ammunition has been found. But India has denied these reports as well. And also please understand, there's something else that you need to know. Both Russia and Israel are top weapon suppliers to India. Right? They're always in the top 3, top 4. Both have been very critical for our military modernization. But ever since the wars began in Ukraine and Gaza, their weapon supplies to India has gone down. Obviously, they are meeting their own requirements. Russian defense industry is first prioritizing Russian military requirements. Israeli defense industry has done the same. We had a lot of pending contracts and orders both with Russia and Israel, and these orders have been cut down. India has not been receiving the promised ammunition and weapons and military hardware. This has affected India's defense modernization plans. So, given this reality, it's unlikely that India would export arms and ammunition to Russia or Israel or of course to Ukraine. So, India has made the position very clear. The official position is that we are not exporting arms and ammunition either to Israel and even to Russia or even to Ukraine. The possibility is there could be others who are procuring from India, third parties, and then re-exporting it. So, India is trying to plug this as well. Defense Ministry and External Affairs Ministry with the concerned authorities are working together to plug this gap as well, so that Indian ammunition is not found either in the Gaza war or in the Ukraine war. Next, on a related note, yesterday a resolution was brought up at UN General Assembly against Israel. This resolution accused Israel of being in illegal occupation of Palestinian territory, and it orders Israel to vacate and withdraw from the occupied territory in Palestine. It sets a deadline of 1 year. It proposes sanctions as well on Israel, and it mandates Israel to withdraw from Palestinian territories which are seen as illegally occupied territories. Majority of the countries supported the resolution, but however, it's a non-binding resolution. It's not legally binding. Why? Because UNGA has no enforcement powers, unlike UN Security Council. So UNGA resolutions are non-binding in nature. Now India abstained from this vote. Now this is very unique and very different from our earlier position. Because if you look at Palestinian territories, be it West Bank or Gaza or even the Golan Heights of Syria, which are all under the occupation of Israel, India also recognizes them as illegally occupied territories. In fact, most countries, even United States, the closest ally of Israel, recognizes Palestinian territories to be under illegal occupation of Israel. Be it Gaza or West Bank, they are seen as illegally occupied territories. Even the Golan Heights of Syria is seen as illegally occupied territory by Israel. So in the past, whenever such resolutions were brought up, India always voted against Israel, mandating Israel to vacate these occupied areas, and this is consistent with our position on the two-state solution. India has always supported the creation of Palestine. It's an ideological commitment of India. Since 1947-48, we have remained committed to the creation of Palestine. Even now we say that Israel never allowed Palestine to be created, and Israel should create the opportunity for establishment of Palestine as a separate independent state. We support the two-state plan. We see this as a viable long-term solution to bring peace and settle this conflict. But however, this time India abstained from the vote. Usually we would vote against Israel. We never had hesitation to call these territories as occupied territories by Israel. But this time we have abstained, and there is a reason behind it. The primary reason is that the wording of the resolution was very harsh. It was seen as unreasonable by India. The proposed one-year deadline for Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories was seen as unreasonable. First of all, it can't be enforced. And second, the proposal to have sanctions on Israel is something that put off India. If not for that, India has always supported such resolutions calling for Israel's vacation of the occupied territories and creation of Palestine. So this represents the complex position that India has on Israel-Palestine conflict. So we do support the creation of Palestine. We are committed ideologically to the two-state plan, but at the same time, we don't unnecessarily target Israel. As Israel is a key strategic partner, we have found this balance in the relationship between Israel, Palestine and the Arab countries. In the past, India was forced by others as well to change its position, to take a stand against Israel, to not even have relations with Israel. But today things have changed. In the last 3 decades, Israel has become a key strategic partner, but doesn't mean we overlook the atrocities that allegedly Israel commits. Doesn't mean we overlook the illegal occupation by Israel of Palestinian territory. So India was taking this balanced position where we would criticize Israel, vote against Israel as well on matters of illegal occupation. We would support the creation of Palestine, but we support Israel as well when it comes to fighting terrorism. Right? The October 7th attack was called by India as a terrorist attack, but we have never labeled Hamas itself as a terrorist group. And we have never blamed Hamas for the Gaza war, which was triggered on October 7th. So that is the balanced position of India, where we play both sides and we try to push for talks and negotiations. So this stand of India is a departure from the earlier position. Usually we would vote against Israel, but we have abstained from it because India found the resolution to be unreasonable. Problem was with the deadline of 1 year, the proposal of sanctions, the way in which it was being aggressively promoted as if it was seen to target Israel. So India has said that we should not increase the divisions, rather we should bring Israel-Palestine together. We should allow Palestine to be created and provide an opportunity for peace and not create more hatred and divisions. So that is the reason why India has taken a different position this time on the question of occupied Israeli territories in Palestine. Is that clear? So this completes the detailed discussion of all the major articles. Now let's take a quick look at the prelim section and wrap up the discussion for today. So before I start, you can join my Telegram channel by scanning the QR code, where I will be sharing a lot of updates and important developments. Let's look at this article from page 17. It's related to the rate cut that was recently carried out by the US Federal Reserve. The US Federal Reserve is the central bank of United States that controls the monetary policy, that controls the liquidity of the US dollar. Just like RBI manages the monetary policy of India, the US Fed does the similar task. Recently, the US Fed has cut the interest rates, which is a big development. And any such changes in monetary policy of the US, it has an impact on countries like India. So that is what you need to know. What happens when US Fed cuts the rates? What happens to India when the rates are increased? Let's take a look. When the rates are cut by the Federal Reserve, when interest rates comes down, what happens? It basically increases the liquidity in the American market. The dollar will become essentially cheaper to borrow. So there will be a flood of US dollars, the cost of capital as we call it, right, that reduces. It becomes easier to procure the dollar, to take more loans in the American market, and the increase in liquidity is good news for emerging economies like India. Why? Because generally when there is more liquidity in the American market, which is a developed market, so there the interest you can earn is very less, especially when interest rates have been cut. The return on investment would be very nominal. So what investors do, they borrow the cheaper dollar from the American banks in the American market, and they bring it to emerging economies like India. They invest that in India as it can give them higher returns because of the higher rates in India. So reduction in US Federal Reserve rates is good news for emerging economies like India. And vice versa is also true. If the Fed increases the rates, which means investors can get decent and stable returns in a stable economy. So you will see a flight of capital from emerging economies. All the investors will withdraw their investments from emerging countries like India, and they'll reinvest back in stable economies like US, even at a decent rate when there is a rate increase. We suffered from this back a few years ago after the global recession, the 2008-2009 recession. The US Federal Reserve adopted a policy called quantitative easing, where it relaxed the monetary policy, reduced the rates to historically low levels, almost zero, which increased the availability of dollar, right, which increased liquidity and brought investments into emerging economies like India. But all of a sudden, when the Federal Reserve withdrew the policy of quantitative easing and started increasing the rates, we saw a sudden flight of capital. The foreign investments fled from emerging markets like India, hurting the Indian economy, right? So you need to be aware of this impact. What happens to Indian markets, investments in India, when US Federal Reserve increases or decreases the interest rates? This is the general trend or pattern. Now, in the recent case, India's chief economic advisor, Ananta Nageshwaran, has said that the positive impact on India would be very minimal because of the global economic conditions. The global economy is going through a lot of turmoil. So it's not necessary that the rate cut by the US Fed will directly benefit India and we'll see a sudden surge in capital investment in India. It may not happen as well. There are other factors at play. But generally, this is the linkage. Rate cut in by the US Federal Reserve is good for India. It can bring more investments. Rate increase is bad for India because from emerging economies, there could be a flight of capital. Now, coming to the last topic, on the supplement page of Science and Tech section, we have an article referring to brain-eating amoeba, a deadly disease that has been reported in the state of Kerala. It is reported in many other parts of the world as well. It is technically called as PAM, primary amoebic meningoencephalitis, or more popularly known as brain-eating amoeba. Now, many such outbreaks were reported. It's a very deadly condition with a high mortality rate. It's called brain-eating amoeba because once infected, it essentially eats away the brain tissue, destroys the brain tissue, leading to encephalitis and eventual death of the affected person. Now, how does one get infected with this brain-eating amoeba, or the amoeba which causes this disease? Naegleria fowleri. This is the microscopic pathogen, the amoeba which causes this condition called brain-eating amoeba, where the brain tissue is damaged, leading to encephalitis and eventual death. Now, the question is, how does one get infected? See, this amoeba is generally found in stagnant water bodies, in lakes and ponds which are stagnant, especially freshwater lakes and ponds. You might find them in rural areas, in small villages. There would be tanks, ponds and lakes where water is stored. right? And the stagnant fresh water could become a breeding ground for such amoeba. And also they thrive in warm and moist conditions, right? So in places like Kerala, where you have warm, moist climatic conditions, it could promote the growth of such amoeba. Maybe global warming plays a role as well. Researchers are looking at the possible angle. So when you swim in such waters, or when you take a dive especially, or when you snort the water, right, especially when the water flows up your nasal canal, that is when the chances of infection are very high. Research has established that this particular amoeba primarily enters through the nasal route, right up your nasal canal, then reaches into the brain area. This is how the infection has been spreading. So basically, more awareness is needed to check the infections, because once infected, the situation will deteriorate very quickly. In most cases, the diagnosis is not done at the right stage, and because of delayed diagnosis, the patient would have already deteriorated considerably, where the brain tissue would have been significantly destroyed and damaged. So mortality rate is extremely high. We have very, very few survivors. Around the world, very few people have survived this condition caused by this particular amoeba. Right? There have been such outbreaks in South Korea as well, in United States, in Kerala, in India. Recently, especially, multiple back-to-back cases came up. So what you need is better awareness to encourage people to not swim or use the waters of such stagnant lakes and ponds. Right? Don't use it for drinking, don't use it to wash your face, don't snort the water up, or don't dive, because when you dive, the water gushes into your nasal canal, lodging the amoeba right up the nasal canal, which then easily gets transported into the brain, right? So these are basic measures. Awareness is needed. You don't find this amoeba in swimming pools or chlorinated waters. It's only found in stagnant fresh waters like lakes and ponds. That's why you need awareness, greater awareness, which has to be spread to change the behavior of the community. Especially it affects young children, teenage and young adults are mainly affected. So Kerala has done quite well to manage the condition, and it has even managed to save a few lives with early detection and aggressive treatment. Now this is another important step. Apart from better awareness to prevent the infection from occurring, what you need is quick diagnosis. For that, you have to prepare your healthcare system. Both public and private healthcare institutions should be aware of the problem, right? Because usually such outbreaks are limited to certain areas where stagnated pools are located, where the pathogen is present. So in such high risk areas, if the medical system, the healthcare system is aware, they can quickly look out for the symptoms, diagnose quickly, and put the patients on aggressive treatment. What has worked in Kerala is the aggressive cocktail of antibiotics. Very aggressive line of treatment has been adopted using a cocktail, a combination of antibiotics, which has been proven to be quite effective in addressing the condition. And a patient has survived, which is very, very rare. It's extremely rare for a patient to survive after this infection. So that is a strategy that Kerala has adopted. One side, awareness to change the behavior, to spread this information amongst the public, right? For example, using nasal caps, ear plugs, nasal plugs to prevent the water from entering, avoiding such stagnant water bodies. That is a basic preventive measure where behavioral change is needed. The other measure is quick diagnosis, aggressive line of treatment to save lives. So that is what Kerala has done, and it has managed to deal with this infectious outbreak which was seen in Kerala. It doesn't spread from one person to another, but it does infect the affected person, right? So that is what we take away from today's newspaper, and I hope you've understood everything and you found the session to be useful. So do let me know what you think. If you like the session, please press the like button, share your comments, and come back at 2 p.m. because today we'll be analyzing the essay paper, which would be completed just in a short while. So that is it for today. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.